you know, if she was misbehaving, I could basically just look at her and then she'd quit, you know. But my son, it was like, that was just nothing. You're looking at me, it's like, no, that's just not going to go anywhere, man. And so then I'd like tell him to stop, and that really wasn't having much of an effect either. He'd just sort of maybe laugh or run away or whatever. I mean, he was a tough little rat. And you know, what I would do with him is he would be doing something and I'd interfere and he'd get upset and, you know, angry, and so then I'd get him to sit on the steps, and I told him, and this is when he was about 2, I said, look, you're going to sit on the steps, that's time out, you're going to sit on the steps until you've got control of yourself and you can come back and play the family game again. I basically said, be a civilized human being and then you're welcome again. And so he'd sit on the steps. It was so interesting to watch because he was just enraged. He'd sit there, like, have you ever seen a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum? It's really quite the bloody phenomena. If you ever saw an adult do that, you'd call 911 right away. It's like, oh my God. In kids, it's like, well, first of all, they're only this long, so how much trouble can they really cause? But it's like, you know, they're just completely gone. They're like on the floor, their face is red, they're just furious, like way more furious than you ever get if you're even vaguely socialized. They're just outraged and they're kicking and hitting the ground, and like, it's like a little epileptic fit of anger, you know. They're completely controlled by their rage. And we took care of one kid for a while who, he was actually a pushover, that kid. You could get him to behave by, you know, kind of shaking your finger at him, but his mother thought he was really tough because he had her figured out. And one of the things he would do is have a temper tantrum, and during the temper tantrum he would hold his bloody breath until he turned blue. It's like, try that, like, you know, that's your homework. Go home and have a temper tantrum, and while you're doing it, hold your breath until you actually turn blue. It's like, you won't be able to do it. You don't have the willpower of a 2-year-old, that's for sure. That little varmint, man, he'd just have a fit, then he'd hold his breath, and then he'd turn blue. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And we would just like let him do it, and you know, he'd turn blue and everybody would be gone and he'd come out of it, you know, and it didn't work. So he just quit doing it. I think he did it like twice, and he figured out, oh well, that's a lot of work for very little outcome. And you know, it's not like 2-year-olds are stupid. They're not stupid. They're probably smarter than you, but they're not civilized by any stretch of the imagination. And so anyways, back to my son, I'd put him on the steps and he'd be like, just like enraged and trying to get himself together, you know. And I'd wait a few, I had a strict rule, which was, as soon as you're done, you're welcome again. So it's completely under your control. No grudge, nothing. Anyways, he'd sit on the steps and he's just enraged and trying to control himself, and I'd watch that, and then, you know, I'd come back after about 2 minutes or whatever, and he'd still be, I'd say, well, you know, have you got yourself under control? Are you ready to get off the steps? And he'd go, no, not yet. And then, you know, he'd get himself under control, and then he'd come back, and, you know, he'd be contrite, and then I would like him right away, you know. You got to watch that, you know, because you don't like being dominated by a 2-year-old. No one does. So when he was contrite, then he'd come, and then, you know, we'd just go on like nothing had happened, because that's what you want to do, right? As soon as you get compliance, especially if the compliance is in the best interest of the child, you want to reward it instantly, right? That's the right thing to do, because so then, and you could just see him gaining control over himself. And so really what was happening is, in his mind, in his brain, we'll say, there was a war between the psyche, the ego, that was starting to become integrated, you know, and starting to become a continuous person, an identity. And it's fragile in 2-year-olds, and it can be disrupted all the time, and it is. That's why they're so hyper emotional. It's fragile, that little ego, and it doesn't have a lot of power. And so what you want to do is reward it when it wins. You know, it's when he gets control over the underlying motivations. You want to say, hey, good work, man, good work, kid, you did it, you know, you got yourself under control, way to be. And the kid's really happy about that, because it's actually not that much fun to have a temper tantrum. It's exhausting.